Salvete, amici Europae Romaique. Welcome to Libertas Europae, where we analyze and celebrate European history and culture. Today I'm bringing you the complete history of Rome, or more specifically the first video in this 8-part series, which will cover the entirety of Roman history from the very beginnings to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So this is why I'm calling it the complete history of Rome. Another reason is because I'm in this series not just going to look at the sort of meat and potatoes of history, the kings and wars, or in the Roman case, the magistrates and emperors and their wars, but I'm also going to look at the more ordinary side of history. I'm going to look at the way people lived. I'm going to look at what it was like to be a senator, an equestrian, an ordinary plebeian, what it was like to be a slave in Roman society, what it was like to be a woman, a child in Rome, what it was like to be a gladiator, a soldier. We're going to look at how people made a living, the language people used. We're going to look at literature, at drama. We're going to look at the complete picture of what the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire was like. So this is part 1, where we are going to look at the rise of Rome. We're going to look at, from the start here, the starting date I'm putting here is circa 1000 BC because we don't know when Rome started. And this is just a nice round date. All the way to 237, that's the end of the First Punic War. So we're going to look at the rise of Rome from a small and insignificant city-state to the major power in the Western Mediterranean. And then in the second video we're going to talk about how the Mediterranean became known as the Mare Nostrum, our sea. That is how Rome rose from this major regional power in Italy and some of the surrounding islands to the master of the entire Mediterranean basin. And also towards the end of that period going to look at the beginnings of the Roman Revolution, so-called, the process that eventually unraveled the Roman Republic. And this process continues in the third part, where we look at the so-called classical period. We look at the various civil wars that brought down the Republic. And then we're going to look at the reconstitution of the Roman state under Augustus. Then in the fourth part, we're going to look at the empire at its greatest territorial extent. We're going to look at what it was like to live in the empire. And towards the end of that period, we're also going to look at the 3rd century crisis in a lot of depth, which is this roughly half a century of civil wars that almost brought the empire to its ruin. Then in the 5th part, we're going to look at the rise of Christianity and how Christianity becomes the dominant religion in the empire. We're also going to look at the division of the empire into an eastern and a western part. And we're going to look at how this western part becomes overrun by hostile barbarians and eventually crumbles away into nothingness by 476. In part 6, we're going to look at efforts by the Emperor Justinian to reconquer these lost territories, what he called the Renovatio Imperii. And indeed Justinian is successful in reconquering the African provinces and Italy. However, those gains do not last. In this part, we're also going to look at a major war between the empire of the Romans and that of the Persians. And this is a very destructive war where both sides sustain heavy losses, but the Romans eventually come on top. But then we see the rise of another new religion, that is Islam, and this newly formed Islamic Caliphate ends up conquering most of both of these empires. And Rome can only barely hold on at this point, but they do repel the Islamic invaders eventually and secure their empire. Then in the 7th part, we're going to look at the rise of a new empire in Western Europe claiming to be Roman, that is the Holy Roman Empire. And we're going to look at the conflict between Western and Eastern Christianity. We're going to look at the Great Schism that separated Catholicism and the Eastern churches. And finally, this conflict will culminate in the Fourth Crusade, in which these Crusader armies conquer Constantinople and shatter the empire. The empire is then later reconstituted. However, it always remains from this point on a shadow of its former self. It hangs on for quite another while, but then in 1453 it is finally conquered by the Ottoman Turks. And towards the end of this video, we're going to summarize the history of the empire and look at its legacy, which of course is quite substantial. Alright, let's jump in for this first video with the rise of Rome. And of course we begin with the founding of Rome. Now, we don't actually know how Rome was founded. What we do have is a couple of myths, which I'm going to relate to you now, or at least one version of them, because there are various different versions and different myths, particularly the myth of Aeneas and that of Romulus and Remus. And what I've done here is put them all into a logical sequence and a logical, consistent story. But do keep in mind that there are several different versions of these tales. So we have Aeneas, who is the son of Anchises and Venus, a Trojan who plays a minor role in Homer's Iliad. And after the destruction of Troy, he leads a group of Trojan refugees throughout the Mediterranean on a kind of odyssey, and finally landing in Italy, where he founds a city called Lavinium. And there he has a son called Ascanius or Iulus. And this Iulus founds the city of Alba Longa and becomes its first king. Iulus is the founder of a dynasty who reigns in Alba Longa, and his descendant eventually is King Brocas, who has himself two sons called Numitor and Amulius. And when Brocas dies, Amulius usurps the throne. He imprisons his elder brother and he kills his brother's son and forces his daughter, Rea Silvia, to become a Vestal Virgin. That is, someone who is forbidden from having intercourse, who cannot marry, cannot have any children, and thus cannot produce any heirs that might eventually threaten Amulius's throne. However, Rea Silvia is impregnated by the god Mars and gives birth to two boys, twins, Romulus and Remus. And of course, Amulius is rather irate at this, but he decides to show mercy and doesn't kill Rea Silvia as her position as a Vestal Virgin would ordinarily require. But instead he only imprisons her and he orders these two boys killed. However, the servant tasked with killing the boys doesn't actually kill them. Instead, he sets them adrift the river Tiber, where they eventually wash ashore and are there suckled by a she-wolf. And then later on they are taken in by a shepherd and his wife, who raise them to manhood. And once they are grown, they overthrow their uncle Amulius and restore their grandfather to the throne. Then they found a city on the 21st of April. Traditional date is 753. So later on the Romans are completely certain that the day that they found the city is the 21st of April, but there's considerable discussion over the year they found the city. But later on, the sort of consensus date that's emerged is 753. So Remulus and Remus found the city, but then they quarrel. It's not quite clear. There's different versions of exactly what they were fighting over, perhaps on which hill they should build the city. In any case, Romulus slays his brother Remus, as well as a couple of his followers, and names the city after himself, Rome, and becomes the first king of the city. After him there are a number of other kings, 7 kings in total, with the last one being named Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. Tarquin the Proud, as he's known in English, is a very harsh and autocratic king. Supposedly comes into power by killing his predecessor, and he displeases the Romans by his constant building projects and forces them to work for him, to build, for example, the temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the temple to Jupiter the best and the greatest, which was found on the Capitoline Hill. And he also reportedly is the builder of the Cloaca Maxima, the Roman sewer. And here you can see a model of what this temple to Capitoline Jupiter might have looked like. But then the final straw comes when Tarquin's son, also named Tarquin, decides to rape the daughter of a senator, a woman known as Lucretia. It is a very famous depiction of this event, a painting by Titian from the 16th century. You see Tarquin forcing himself on Lucretia. Lucretia then confesses this rape to her family and kills herself, and the incensed Romans then decide to overthrow the king, and this revolt is led by a man named Lucius Junius Brutus, who forces Tarquin to flee the city. And after Tarquin has fled, the Romans institute a new form of government called the res publica, the republic, literally the public thing, because now the government is no longer the possession of a king, but rather it is a public thing that the public is supposed to participate in. In place of the king, they now institute 2 magistrates called consuls, who jointly rule and replace the king. Much of the other institutions in the early republic were already present under the monarchy, so we shouldn't think of the monarchy as being an absolute monarchy, although that is what it tended towards under Tarquin. But for most of the monarchy, we had the Senate, we had some of the assemblies that we're going to look at in a bit. So we don't have an absolute monarchy, we have certain representative elements already present under the monarchy, and these of course are continued and expanded upon in the Republic. Brutus, as well as a man named Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, who was Lucretia's husband, become the first consuls. So this is the traditional account, or at least one version of the traditional account. The question is, should we take any of this seriously? Well, there are some parts of this story that are clearly more myth than history. All this story about Aeneas and Romulus and Remus, that's very fanciful and we cannot take that seriously. No serious historian, of course, believes that Rome was founded by a demigod or anything like that. That's all nonsense. And also about this founding date of Rome, this 753 date. As mentioned already, the Romans weren't even sure about this date. There were several different accounts. And modern historians aren't even sure whether there was such a thing as a founding of Rome, whether there was some sort of discrete event where the city was founded, or whether there was rather some sort of continuous process where just a particular village or a collection of villages just sort of grew and eventually became more and more city-like without any sort of distinct date that could be made out. But be that as it may, this early history, these early stories are not really history, they're more myth and legend. As for those kings, the traditional account has 7 kings here in a period of 244 years. This is rather implausible. It's very unusual for kings to rule for that long. And it would be perfectly possible by chance to have 1 or 2 kings who rule for a very long time, but to have 7 kings who rule for this long is quite unlikely, although no, of course not impossible. However, the broad outline of this transition from monarchy to republic is probably accurate, and we know that Rome was a republic, and there's enough evidence that it was at one point a monarchy that we can take this sort of general story at face value. So let's look at a couple of maps to see where we are. Here on the left hand side we see Rome, and as you can see it's surrounded by all these Etruscan cities. The Etruscans are somewhat mysterious people because they speak a language that is not in fact Indo-European, as are all the languages that are spoken in other parts of Italy at this point, at least the ones we know of. So it's rather unusual, which has led historians to traditionally suppose that they're some sort of outside force that moves into Italy, but more recent archaeological evidence suggests that the Etruscans are indeed a people that is native to Italy and who lived here for a very long time. And we see they have all these cities that are around Rome, so it's natural to suppose that the Etruscans at some point ruled Rome, that Rome was part of some sort of Etruscan federation possibly, and also the ancient sources suggest that the 5th king as well as the 7th king, the TARQUIN Superbus, were in fact Etruscans. Another major force in Greece is the Greeks. Let me bring this one up here so you can see it completely. See here lots and lots of Greek colonies around here, and more down here, and a lot of them in Sicily. So the Romans from very early on had contact with the Greeks. So now let's look at the Latin language. Latin is an Indo-European language. It's part of the Italic branch of the Indo-European language family. Latin was just one of many Italic languages. Nowadays all these other Italic languages are extinct. To the extent that anything survives of them, it's There were some words and phrases that were imported into Latin. Of course, due to the domination of the Roman Empire, all these other languages just gradually disappeared. Nowadays, the Italic languages are represented by Latin and its successor languages, the Romance languages. Let's look at the Latin alphabet. Here we see the alphabet as it was in the early Republic. And these are the letters as the Romans would have pronounced them. R, B, K, D, E, F, Zeta, H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, X. You notice there's a couple of letters missing, like where is a G? There's a Z here, but no G. Well, the reason we have no G is that C and G were originally the same letter. They both of these sounds, K and G, were represented by this single letter, and then later on they added the G. And we also don't have a J. This letter was J is in fact just a modified version of the I. Just add like a little thing down here to the I and you get a J. J is actually a much later addition to the Latin script. This is we're talking about the Middle Ages here. And then we also have this letter here, and this letter I pronounced as U. That is, this is in fact our letter U. It's not the V. V is a letter that's also introduced much later in the Middle Ages to differentiate, and back then you had this letter U doing double duty as both the U and the V. And then you also don't have the Y, which we're going to get to right now. Now we look at a somewhat later stage of the language and the more famous stage of the language, that is the classical Latin alphabet. That's the alphabet that was used in the 1st century BC. We have the letters, most of the letters are the same, but now we have the addition of the G, the G, and we also have the letter Y here, the Y or Y as the Romans called it. And the Y as well as the Zeta are basically just used for Greek loan words. The native Roman words typically don't use these letters. One thing that stands out if you see Roman inscriptions is that they only use capital letters, and they also use almost no punctuation. So take a look, for example, at this inscription from the Arch of Titus. Senatus populusque Romanus divu Tito divi Vespasiani filio Vespasiano Augusto. Notice it's just a stream of letters, and if you look very closely here, you can see a little mark here that's called an interpunct, as well as here and here and here, here as well as here. These separate one word from the other, so we didn't have spaces to separate words, but this little mark here that's almost invisible here, and in some inscriptions you don't even have that. So for example, if we take a look at this inscription from the Colosseum, here you just have a stream of letters, just one letter after the other, and as the reader it's up to you just to decide where does one word end and the next one begin. The Romans also didn't have commas or full stops or colons or anything like that. So this made the language quite a bit harder to read, but obviously the Romans managed somehow. And we see, of course, later on, see the introduction of lowercase letters, first in the form of a cursive script that we see in the later empire, used for sort of informal writing letters and so on. But the sort of standard introduction of this distinction of uppercase and lowercase letters has to wait for the Carolingian minuscule in the 8th century, so the early Middle Ages. But of course, in the Latin that I've reproduced here, and also the Latin that you see in modern texts, we of course follow these modern conventions of having uppercase and lowercase letters. We have various forms of punctuation just to make things easier to read. And we also have the distinction between the letters U and V. But letter I and J is in many scripts not differentiated. A lot of classicists sort of want to be a bit more pure and have the J also represented by an I. I personally don't follow that convention. I think it's rather silly to say that we're going to differentiate between U and V, but not between I and J. That's rather arbitrary. And having that J certainly helps with pronunciation, because although there's sort of a rule of thumb that tells you in almost all cases how an I is to be pronounced, whether it's to be pronounced as E or Y, but it doesn't work in all cases. So for example, in the case of Iulus, the son of Aeneas, who we've already encountered, if you looked at his name and you didn't differentiate between I and J, you would look at that name and think it is pronounced Iulus, but in fact it is Iulus. This extra syllable, this short syllable E, is a syllable of its own, Iulus, not Iulus. And that's just something you wouldn't know if you just looked at the ancient script. And if you don't distinguish between I and J, which is why I've done that for your convenience, as well as for mine, so I can more easily pronounce things. Speaking of pronunciation, here I'm going to give you a quick crash course in classical pronunciation. What do we mean by classical pronunciation? Well, classical Latin and classical pronunciation is a language that was spoken by the educated Romans in Rome during the classical period, which is roughly from 75 BC to AD 14. And this is sort of the international standard of pronouncing Latin. And if you follow these rules and apply them consistently, even though I'm not giving you the complete set of rules, but just sort of a quick and dirty version, but if you follow these rules, your pronunciation is in fact going to be better than that of most classicists, that is, most professionals who use Latin. Don't really have a very good pronunciation, but with this quick introduction I'm going to give you a big leg up. So let's get started. First we look at the vowels. So we have these 5 basic vowels. We also have the Y, but that's not very important. This, as I said, only occurs in Greek loanwords. So we have these vowels both as long and short versions. So I'll pronounce the long ones first. A, E, I, O, U. Once again, and please repeat after me unless you're in a situation where that would be rather embarrassing. But if it is at all possible, please speak along with me. A, E, I, O, U. Alright, now the short vowels. They're A, E, I, O, U. And here with the short vowels, there's some debate over exactly how they should be pronounced, whether they should differ from the long vowels only in quantity, that is in length, or whether there's also qualitative differences. I've linked a video here where a YouTuber called LUCRETIA discusses this matter in a lot more detail, but for all purposes, let's just say that the short letters are pronounced, and again, speak after me, A, E, I, O, U. A, E, I, O, U. Okay, and it is in fact very important that you differentiate between long and short letters, long and short vowels, because these are an important phonemic feature in Latin. They differentiate between different words. So for example, we have the words populus and populus. Populus means people and populus means poplar tree. So quite an important distinction. Then we have the diphthongs. And these are not all the diphthongs, just some of the more important ones. Particularly these two, these two are the most important ones, the I and the au. And then we have the oi and the eu. These ones are again not very important. They don't occur nearly as often as the first two. So I'm going to say them again and again, repeat after me. I, au, oi, eu. I, au, oi, eu. Alright, and then the consonants. With the consonants, you're in luck because most of the consonants are in fact pronounced just like they are in English. So this one is a lot easier. Of course, there are more consonants than there are vowels, but most of them, as I said, you don't have to learn them specifically. So I'm just going to note here the consonants where there in fact is a difference in pronunciation. So first the C, or the K as the Latins pronounced it, and that pronunciation already gives the game away, that the C is always pronounced K. It's always K, never S or Z, always K. The G is always pronounced G. It's never pronounced J as in gems, always G. The J is always pronounced Y. The Q always occurs together with the letter U, just like in English, and it's pronounced Kv, not K, as in the, or at least most of the Romance languages, but Qu. This is the R, and the R is pronounced trilled. It's not R, as in rhotic varieties of English, or at least standard varieties of English, but rather it's R. And this is a sound that's rather difficult for native English speakers, or at least most of them. I mean, the trilled R is also present in some varieties of English, but for most varieties we have this R sound, not the R. So it's rather difficult for English speakers to pronounce. It's also difficult for me as I'm a native German speaker, and Standard German also doesn't have this version of the R. So when I'm going to pronounce words, I'm probably sometimes going to mess this one up. Then we have the S. The S is always unvoiced, always S, never Z, as in bees, always S. The T is always pronounced T, T. It's never sh or ch, as in nation. It's always T. The V is always pronounced W, as in where, never V, as in vast, always W. And then we have some combinations of letters that are a bit special. So I said that the G is always pronounced G. It's not quite true. When it's followed by an N, it's actually pronounced ng. So for example, the word Magnus is not actually pronounced Magnus. Great. It's rather pronounced Magnus. Magnus. not Magnus, Magnus. And then the NG, here the N is also pronounced U. So, for example, language is not lingua, but lingua. And this rule is something that's, I think, rather intuitive. Most people would pronounce it like that anyway, but this is one you have to watch out for. It's U, not gn. One thing more about consonants. Consonants actually, if you have double consonants in Latin, this is actually an important distinction. It's also a phonemic feature of Latin. And these double consonants, they are spoken longer. So if you look at these two words, annus, and this is annus. Annus, annus. The first one, annus, is old woman, and this annus is year. And by the way, neither of these words means anus. Anus is also a Latin word, of course, but anus has a long R sound at the beginning. The short R is annus, meaning old woman. Okay, then we get the rule for nasalization. So when we have the letter M at the end of a word, which is not followed by a consonant in the immediately succeeding word. In that case, the M is not pronounced like a consonant, rather it's silent, and the vowel before that becomes long and nasal. So AM at the end of a word is not pronounced but EM at the end of a word is not pronounced M but E. So these 5 nasal vowels are O, E, O, E, Now this sounds rather awkward if you begin pronouncing Latin like this. So this is a rule that most speakers of Latin nowadays just skip, because it does take some getting used to, but this is in fact how the ancient Romans spoke. So this is the rule I'm striving to follow. And there's another nasalization rule, and that is if you have N followed by S or N followed by F, then the N is silent and the preceding vowel is again long and nasal. So for example, the word censor is not, in Latin, is not pronounced censor, but rather caesor, caesor. So let's apply what we learned to some examples. So first of all, we have the name of a very famous Roman, and here in these examples I've added these macrons to mark the long vowels, because in the normal script in Latin the difference between long and short vowels is not marked. You're just supposed to know which vowels are long and which are short. And this makes it rather difficult to pronounce if you encounter an unfamiliar word. Now with the consonants we have this doubling. This is actually marked in the script, but with the vowels it's usually not marked. So in texts aimed at, especially at learners of Latin, you usually see these macrons to mark the long vowels. There were actually also, some of these diacritics were also occasionally used by the actual Romans, but usually you just had to know which vowels were long and short. But here I've marked it for you. In the rest of the Latin I've reproduced here outside of this slide. I've not bothered to add these macrons because it's actually rather tedious to get these on a computer screen. But here for these pronunciation examples I've provided them. So go ahead and try to pronounce this name applying what we've learned. So this one is Julius, Julius, Caesar, Caesar. So it's not Caesar, it's not Caesar, it's not anything like that. It's also not Kaiser, it's Kaisar. So note the k sound here. This is I, and this is s, not z, s. And of course the r is trilled. Kaisar, Kaisar. So Julius Caesar. A very famous quote by Julius Caesar is the following, which I'm sure you've seen before. How would you pronounce this? So this is Veni, Vidi, Vici. Very simple. Veni, Vidi, Vici. Now if you pronounce this Veni, Vidi, Vici, this is not incorrect. That's the traditional Italian pronunciation, or the ecclesiastical pronunciation as it's also called. And that's not wrong. That's a perfectly fine way of pronouncing the language, but it's not the classical pronunciation which I am presenting here. So it's always w, not v, and this is a k and not a ch. So it's Veni, Vidi, Vici. Another common Latin saying. How will you pronounce this? This is pronounced quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. So this is qu. It's not k, it's not kid, it's quid. And it's quo, not quo. And then this is the highest magistrate in the Roman Republic. How would you pronounce him? This is pronounced consul. It's not consul, it's consul. Consul. And then the ultimate example of nasalization is this monster of a word. How would you pronounce this? This is pronounced monstrum. 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 Alright, so as I said, if you internalize all these rules and practice a bit, you will in fact have a better pronunciation of Latin than most of the actual professionals. Okay, let's look a bit at Roman class structure. We have the patricians, the patricii. These are the aristocrats, the old families of Rome, traditionally supposed to be the original companions of Romulus. And then we have the plebeians, the plebs. The plebs are basically everyone else who's a citizen. And whether you're a patrician or a pleb is determined by your father. If your father is a patrician, you're a patrician. If your father is a pleb, you're a pleb. And this also goes for adoptive fathers. So the Romans considered adoptive fathers to be basically as important as real fathers. And so this meant that by being adopted, you could actually change your belonging to the patricians or to the plebs. So you had some plebs who were adopted by patricians, thereby gaining rank and prestige, and you also had patricians who let themselves be adopted by plebs in order to run for certain offices that were reserved to plebs. So these plebs originally had very few political rights, but they, over the course of the early republic, gradually expanded those rights in a conflict known as the struggle of the orders, or the conflict of the orders, traditionally dated from 494 to 287 BC. And I'm not going into any detail about this. There's all these stories about the secession of the plebs, where the plebs supposedly exited the city en masse and all went to the Mons Succor, but many of these stories are rather dubious, and basically all the history we have of this period is from a much later date and it's not very reliable, which is why I'm not going into any detail here. Just suffice to say that over the course of this period, the plebs basically gain all the formal political rights that the patricians have, with some very few and very minor exceptions. And at the end of this period, at least on paper, the plebs actually have more political rights than the patricians, because the plebs have access to almost all of the offices in the state, and there are a couple of offices and important offices that the patricians are barred from. However, the patricians in practice remain much more powerful, but as soon as we get to this middle republic, it's really more important how much money we have rather than whether you were a patrician or a pleb. Okay, let's look at Roman names. Now, the way Romans were named changed quite a bit over the course of their long history, but what we're going to look at here is this most famous naming system, the tria nomina, the three names. And this is the scheme that we had in the classical period, and so this is why it's the most well-known system, and the one we're going to look at now. So first you have a given name, the praenomen, and this is given to you by your parents, and they typically choose from a shrinking list of popular names. So in the beginning, in the early republic, we already have not very many names. Then by the time you get to the classical period, it's down to something like 16 names and only about like a dozen that are actually popular. And because there are so few first names, these are usually just abbreviated. So for example, we have T for Titus, M for Marcus, and C for Gaius. You might ask, why is the abbreviation for Gaius C? Well, as we've already discussed, the Latin alphabet didn't have the G at the beginning, so of course the name Gaius was written with the C, because that's the only letter they had. That's a letter that represented both this K sound and the G sound. And when they introduced this new letter G, they still kept the old abbreviation, just out of custom. And in the early republic and in the regal period, women also had first names. Also, they had a fairly low selection of names. However, women's praenomina disappear more and more, and by the time we get to the classical period, almost no woman has a first name anymore. Then we have the most important name, that's typically just known as nomen, or more formally as nomen gentilicium, and this is your family name. It shows your membership in a clan, in a gens. And then we have an additional name, the cognomen. This was originally a personal name, just like the praenomen, but it gradually develops into a family name and shows you which part of a particular gens you're part of, so which branch of the family you belong to. And originally these names were given to individuals based on some sort of physical characteristic or some sort of deed that they accomplished, and then these names were passed on to their sons and daughters and became family names. And because of this process, not all Romans have this cognomen, but by the time we get to the classical period, almost all of the important Romans are going to have these three names, but many of the plebs will still only have two names. And then in addition, some Romans acquired additional names called agnomina, and agnomen was an additional name that you got either through adoption or as a particular honor. We look at examples of both right now. First example is a very important Roman who we're going to meet in the next video. And his name is Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. So this here, P stands for Publius, that's the praenomen. The nomen is Cornelius, and then we have Scipio as the cognomen. And this Scipio won a very major victory in the Second Punic War at Zama in Africa, which is why he gained the name Africanus. Then we have an even more famous Roman we're going to meet in the third video. He is Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And at least that is the name he was supposed to have. And this is not actually the Julius Caesar, rather it's his great nephew and adoptive son, who was born under the name Gaius Octavius Turinus. And when Octavius was adopted by Caesar in his will, he of course took his father's nomen and cognomen, as he was supposed to do, and he kept his own praenomen, but in this case it just happened to be the same name, which is not a huge coincidence because his name Gaius is in fact a very popular name, was the most popular first name for Romans. And normally, if you're adopted, you're supposed to take this derived version of your old nomen and append it to your name. So in this case, the regular nomen that Octavius was born with would have been transformed into Octavianus. However, there's no evidence that Octavius actually used this name. He just calls himself Gaius Julius Caesar for reasons we're going to get into in the third video. Alright, let's look at the Roman family. So our word family comes from familia, which is not quite the same as our word family. It's a wider concept. It also includes your slaves and other dependents who live in your household. Very important concept when discussing the Roman family is the patria potestas. This is the power that the paterfamilias, the oldest living male in the family, has over his descendants. And this is an almost complete power. The paterfamilias is allowed to beat his children, he can abuse his children, he can sell them to slavery. He even has the vitae necisque potestas, that is the right over life and death. That is, he can just execute his children. However, we should not suppose that Roman fathers were these bloody tyrants who beat and abused and killed their children willy-nilly. Rather, like most fathers in most periods of history, most Roman fathers were perfectly decent chaps who loved their children and tried to do right by them. And in fact, it is extremely difficult to actually find examples of this vitae necisque potestas actually being used. There are some examples of fathers basically executing their children for serious crimes. So for example, there's a story told of Lucius Junius Brutus, the founder of the Republic, who had two sons who conspired with the exiled king to try to get him back into power. And for this crime they were sentenced to death by their father, who at the time was also the consul. But this is just a death sentence for treason rather than a father abusing his authority. And find actual examples of abuses of this patria potestas is very difficult. And that is because although fathers legally had the right to do pretty much whatever they wanted to their children, in practice they were constrained by familial love, by familial bonds, and also by custom, by this idea of the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. That is a Roman tradition. Even though you could abuse the children, you weren't supposed to. That would certainly lower your prestige in the eyes of everyone and would basically make you something like a pariah. I should add here that when we talk about children in this context, fathers having power over the children, we're not just talking about little kids. We're talking about all of your children. If you're the oldest living man in the family, you have power over all your children and their children's children. So it's possible that you're a 50-year-old man and your father's still alive, and that means your father still has this complete power over you, over your children, over your grandchildren if you have any. And I should also add that over time this patriarchal power crumbled, maybe not in law but at least in custom. You have sons and daughters gaining more and more autonomy from their fathers. Let's look at marriage now. So the Romans practiced monogamous marriage just like we do, and these marriages were usually arranged by the paterfamilias of the respective family. So if you were the paterfamilias, you had the duty to arrange marriages, at least for your daughters, also for your sons in many cases. And there were different kinds of marriage. First of all, you have marriage cum manu. So cum manu means with the hand. What this means is that the potestas, the power over the bride, is handed over from the father to the new husband, and the husband then has this almost complete power over his wife. However, it's not quite to the same extent as the power over his children. Most notably, the vita nequisque potestas does not apply to wives. So husbands are not allowed to just kill their wives willy-nilly. And there were three different forms of marriage cum manu. The first is confariatio, the second is quemptio, and the third is usus. Confariatio is a particular ceremony that was practiced mostly by aristocrats in the early republic, and quemptio and usus were also open to plebeians. This form of marriage is common in the early republic, in the regal periods. Later on, this more or less dies out, and instead you have marriage sine manu, without the hand. In this case, the bride stays under her father's potestas, which in theory the father has even greater power over her than her husband would have had, but in practice this meant a lot more autonomy for women, because while they were still the theoretical power of their fathers, they still lived with their new husbands and not under their father's roof. So this meant that in their day-to-day life, their fathers of course had a lot less say. Then let's look at the practice of patronage. This is a relationship between a patron, a patronus, and a client, a cliens. This is a very old institution, supposedly was introduced by the first king Romulus. This is a reciprocal relationship where the patron has to protect the client and uses influence on their behalf, and in return the client serves the patron and votes for him. And if you're a slave and you're freed by your master, you become his client. Now let's look at the Roman form of government, the Res Publica Romana. Traditional dates here are 509 until about 27 BC. The beginning of the Republic, as we've already noted, is not quite certain, but this 509 date is probably at least roughly correct. And then the end of the Republic is often dated to the first settlement of Augustus in 27 BC, but there are also alternative dates for that, because it's not, the Republic did not just end with a bang, but with a whimper. The Republic does not have a written constitution. Rather, they have an unwritten constitution, not too dissimilar from the constitution of the United Kingdom. And here again we have this term mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. That is, the Roman constitution is all about tradition and the way things were always done. This constitution combines elements of the three traditional forms of government: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. And for that reason, one of the ancients thought that the Roman Republic was sort of the perfect form of government that avoided the excesses of any of these individual forms. The Roman Republic is very much concerned with checking tyrannical power. No one is supposed to be too powerful. We have various checks and balances to prevent any one man from taking power. In the Roman Republic, participation, both in terms of voting and running for office, is restricted to male Roman citizens. And not even all citizens. There are also some citizens who didn't have the right to vote, mostly in the Allied city-states. And all offices in the Republic are unpaid. What this means, of course, is that poorer people generally cannot run for office because they can't spend their days doing unpaid work. They actually have to work for a living. So all the people who run for important offices have to be seriously wealthy, especially because a lot of running for office is bribing people more or less directly or indirectly by throwing public games and so on, which is of course very expensive. So let's look at the institutions of the Republic. First of all, we have the Senate, Senatus. This is a council of elders. In fact, the word Senatus is derived from the word senex, old man. And the Senate consists of active and former magistrates. Senators serve for life on good behavior. And the number of senators is not fixed, but rather fluctuates rather wildly. So at some points we only have around 100 senators, at other points we have as many as 1,000. The traditional function of the Senate is to give advice. This is already the function it had in the regal period. And this advice is known as Senatus Consultum. However, over the various wars that the Romans fight, the Senate acquires more and more prestige because it consists of all these former generals and all these statesmen. So these are the people who really know what's what in terms of military and foreign policy and so on, which means that the consulta are more and more taken at face value and regarded as more or less law, even though formally they still have to be ratified by the assemblies. So the Senate, in fact, in terms of explicit powers, has very few, but they have great auctoritas. Auctoritas is one of those Latin words that is difficult to translate. There's no precise modern English equivalent. Of course, it is the root word of our word authority, but it doesn't mean quite the same thing. It's not formal authority, rather something like influence, the sort of prestige that you have that makes people do what you want without you having to explicitly order it or force people. And the Senate is especially respected when it comes to matters of foreign policy and finances. In these areas, the word of the Senate is more or less law, whereas in other areas, there's a bit more give and take. Then we look at the magistrates. First, we have this very important principle of collegiality. So each office was always held by at least 2 men, and each of these could veto his colleagues' actions. In fact, this is where our term veto comes from, because the way you stop someone from doing something is by saying or shouting veto, meaning I forbid. And you could veto your colleagues' actions, and you can also veto the actions of inferior magistrates. There are some scholars, for example the German scholar Robert Bunse, who believe that this principle of collegiality wasn't actually present in the very early Republic. He also believes that in the very early Republic you didn't actually have these 2 consuls. He says that the consulship is actually a somewhat later development, but that's a minority view and we're not going to go into that. All these offices have term limits. For most of them it's 1 year, and magistrates have executive power, potestas. So notice they use the same word here as for the power of a father over his children, and this potestas is symbolized by lictors. Lictors were men who walked around with magistrates and kind of gave them an air of respect and command. And the lictors carried around fasces. This here is a fascis. It's a bundle of rods, and when outside of the sacred precincts of the city, outside the pomerium, they would also affix an axe to the fascis to represent the power of magistrates to execute people and to command in a military fashion. And the higher magistrates, the dictators, consuls and praetors, also have imperium. This is the power of military command. So one of the chief functions of higher magistrates is to serve as generals for the Roman armies. And the magistrate has to preside over the meetings of both the Senate and any of the assemblies. Let's look at a couple of types of magistrates and tribunes. So first of all, you have the consuls, who are the chief executives. And then starting in 501 BC, we have the office of dictator, dictator. And a dictator is appointed for 6 months in case of an emergency, and also appoints a master of horse, the magister equitum, who is kind of second in command. And the dictator is appointed for one particular purpose, to defeat an invading army or something like that. And has basically complete authority in all matters pursuant to this purpose, and then has to resign after 6 months. The idea here is that in the ancient world you don't fight wars in the winter typically, so the campaigning season usually lasts for something like 6 months. So this is why this 6 months term makes sense, because whatever emergency arises is usually going to be over, or at least there's going to be a pause in the fighting after half a year. So from 494 BC you have the office of the tribune of plebs being introduced as part of the struggle of the orders, and these people are supposed to represent the interests of the plebs and do this by having veto power. So if a magistrate or an assembly does something that the tribune thinks is not in the interest of the people, he can stop that by shouting veto, and if the offending party doesn't stop, the tribune is supposed to physically go there, physically restrain the person, to intercede and just stop the person from doing whatever they're doing. And they can do this because the tribunes are sacrosanct. They are not allowed to be harmed on pain of death. Because the idea is that all the plebs have anciently sworn to avenge any injury done to any of their tribunes, and this is later sort of formalized into this, into tribunes being sacrosanct. So this example already shows you that the government in Rome works quite a bit differently from what we're used to. This is a lot more personal and a lot more physical than what you would see in most modern democracies. And it's always a very personal thing. You actually have to be personally there to vote. You couldn't just send a deputy or something. You couldn't vote by mail or anything like that. No, you had to be physically there in the city of Rome to participate. Then in this roughly half century between 444 and 392, we are told that the office of consul was in fact vacant in many of those years, and instead were replaced by various military tribunes with consular power. So here we have more magistrates rather than just two, and it's also part of the struggle of the orders. Then starting in 442 we have a new office called the censor, the censor, and the censor is elected every 5 years, originally also serving a 5-year term but then quickly reduced to 18 months. So we have 1.5 years where we have a censor, and then 3.5 years where you don't have a censor, because the primary purpose of the censor is to oversee the census, and of course census is not done every year, you only need them every 5 years. And also the censors are supposed to supervise public morality, and they for example have the right to remove senators from the Senate row in case of bad behavior, if they not just if they violate any of the rules of procedure or anything like that, but rather if they lead an immoral life, then they're supposed to be barred from the Senate. And this of course is where the modern meaning of the word censor or censorship comes from. Then we have the assemblies, the comitia, and these are forms of direct democracy. So you don't vote for representatives to make laws, rather you vote directly for laws in the assemblies. And also you elect magistrates. These are executive officers, and you have the right in the assembly to declare war or to make peace, although in practice, of course, this is usually decided by the Senate, and the assemblies only rubber stamp the whole thing. And assemblies also have the power to create and dissolve alliances, see the above. So let's look at the different assemblies. We have the Curiate Assembly, the Comitia Curiata. This is the oldest assembly. It goes back all the way to the regal period. Here only patricians can vote, and the plebs can participate, they can watch, they can even speak, but they're not allowed to vote. And this is very important during the regal period, but the Curiate Assembly loses most of its power very early on in the Republican period, also as part of the struggle of the orders. This patrician institution loses all but a few mostly symbolic powers. However, it's sort of important to realize that this assembly is still kept around. It's kept around for centuries and centuries after it loses any sort of relevance. This is a very important feature of the Roman Republic, is that it's a very traditional form of government. It's all about tradition, and you don't just toss out an institution just because it's no longer useful. You preserve the institutions as they were in the times of your ancestors. Then we have the Assembly of the Centuries, Comitia Centuriata. This has of military origin. You have all the citizens assembled here based on the membership in the centuries, the centuriae, which of course are supposed to represent army units. And just like in the army, you're ranked by wealth, because the wealthier citizens can afford better equipment, they're therefore more important in the army, and just like that, they're also more important in this assembly and have more votes in proportion to their numbers. This assembly is usually convened once a year, and its primary purpose is to elect the higher magistrates, the consuls, praetors, and censors every 5 years. And this also serves as a court of appeal in the legal system. Then we have the tribal assembly, the Comitia Tributa. Here all the citizens are allowed to vote, and they vote based on membership in these 35 tribes. Originally these tribes corresponded to locations within the city, but membership in this tribe is passed down from father to son, and since people move around, after some time there was no real geographical correlation anymore. And here this assembly is assembled at the discretion of the magistrates, and it's assembled on a more frequent basis, typically coinciding with market days. And here the citizens vote on legislation, and they also elect lower magistrates, the quaestors, aediles, and military tribunes. And the tribal assembly tries judicial cases, and then we have the plebeian assembly, the concilium plebis. This one is convened by a tribune of the plebs rather than a magistrate. Only plebeians are allowed to vote here, no patricians allowed. And this also votes on legislation and also elects magistrates, or not magistrates, but plebeian aediles and tribunes of plebs, who are kind of like magistrates but not officially magistrates. And it also tries judicial cases. So as you can see, there's a lot of redundancy in the Roman Republic. all sorts of overlapping powers between these assemblies, and you don't have these clearly demarcated spheres of influence as we have in modern democracies. Alright, let's get back to narrative history, and here I'm going to talk about how Rome rises from a city-state to a regional power and becomes the master of Italy, or at least the Italian mainland. And I'm going to be very brief here, because all of this stuff is shrouded in the mists of prehistory. We don't really have any reliable sources before the First Punic War. So all this early history is very speculative. So already starting in the regal period, Rome fights all sorts of wars with its neighbors in Latium, this region here, and gradually increases in power and influence. There's a major setback in 390. You have an expeditionary force of Celts that defeats the Romans at the Battle of the Allia. Allia is a river nearby, and the Celts, or the Gauls as the Romans called them, sack Rome. And as the Romans would have it, ferrum non aurum capitolium servat, that is, iron not gold saved the capital. And the capital is of course the Capitoline Hill, where the government is located. The idea here being that when the Celts had taken most of the city and the Romans continued to hold only the Capitoline Hill, the Celts were in fact then beaten back rather than being bought off. They were defeated militarily and had to leave with their tails tucked between their legs. But modern historians don't really buy that. This is probably just a face-saving lie invented by the Romans. Most likely it was indeed aurum non ferrum which saved the capital. So what most likely happened is that the Romans bought off the Celts, gave them a sum of money in exchange for the Celts leaving again. But be that as it may, either way, the Romans recovered very quickly, and by the time you get to the year 338, Rome is in control of the entire neighboring region and has become the dominant force in the entire region. So here in the 4th century, you have Romans down here controlling a decent chunk of territory, surrounded by the Etruscans, the Umbrians, the Samnites, and down here the Greeks, and of course here the Carthaginians. And up here are the Celts, of course, who ventured into Rome. Let's look at some further expansion. Again, I'm going to be even briefer here. We have another series of wars against the Etruscans, against the Henici, against the Gauls, against the Samnites, against basically everyone in the neighborhood. And Romans are mostly successful. They expand their territory, but then they finally bump into a much stronger opponent, and that is the kingdom of Epirus. Epirus is a Hellenistic kingdom, and their king Pyrrhus is called to Italy to help out the Greek colony of Tarentum. And Pyrrhus is one of the most famous, most successful, most renowned generals of classical antiquity. and he leads a professional army, a highly trained Hellenistic army, supported with elephants, the whole works. Rome has now moved up to the big leagues and has to face this first really serious enemy. And initially they don't fare too well. So Pyrrhus wins 2 major victories over the Romans. However, he also takes heavy losses. And then he's said to have said that another victory like this and I'm ruined, which is where the term Pyrrhic victory comes from. That is a victory which is a victory in name only. It's actually really a defeat because you lost so much along the way. And at the same time, Pyrrhus is also at war with Carthage, and he has difficulties resupplying his troops in Italy, whereas the Romans can resupply much more easily on their home ground. So eventually the Romans outlast him and Pyrrhus has to retreat, and the war ends in basically a draw. So this draw actually turns into a victory for the Romans, as the Romans are able to establish a hegemonic position in all of mainland Italy. But we shouldn't think of Italy at this point just being all part of the Roman state. Rather, the Romans had a complicated system of alliances with all these defeated enemies, with the so-called socii, the allies. So these states that the Romans conquered become client states. Usually they lose some part of their territory, which then is colonized by the Romans, but most of the territory they actually keep, and they're allowed to administrate this territory more or less independently. All they pretty much had to do is to provide a certain number of troops upon request, and also supply their equipment. And they also couldn't make their own foreign policy anymore. They had to rely on Rome for that. The inhabitants of these allied states were usually either peregrini, that is non-citizens, or civitates sine suffragio, citizens without the vote. And often what was done is that some of the elites of a allied city-state were given citizenship in Rome, whereas most of the people were not, which then made the elites more likely to support Roman policy. Let's look at the army of the Republic. So originally the Romans fought like the Greeks in phalanxes with a spear and shield. Their army consists of a levy of citizen militia, and the Latin word for levy is legio, which is legion. And soldiers have to provide their own equipment, which means they have to own some land to have an income that allows them to equip themselves. This also means that the wealthier citizens are better equipped and part of more important units. So in the first half of the 4th century, this Roman army is reformed. Instead of fighting as a phalanx, you have these more flexible units called manipuli, which gave up some of the strength of the Greek phalanx, but also made it more flexible. And a very important part of the army is the allied troops. These usually would make up something like a half or a little bit more than half of a Roman army. And usually you had the Romans in the center and then the allies on the flanks. Let's look at the legion. So first of all, we have the equites. these are horsemen, literally, and originally they were light cavalry, and then later around 200 BC you see a transition more towards heavy cavalry. Then in terms of infantry we have the velites. These are skirmishers fighting with ranged weapons, usually deployed at the beginning of a fight, and then they retreat and the more heavy infantry advances. Let's get to the heavy infantry, which is sort of the bread and butter, the core of the Roman army. These men fight in dense formations, originally as a phalanx and later with this manipular system. So you have the hastati. These are younger soldiers who fight in the first rank, literally spearmen. Then we have the principes. These are the soldiers in their prime, people in their 20s, early 30s, who are at the height of their physical power and who've already managed to gather some experience. And then you have the triarii. These are seasoned veterans who've seen it all, who have the most experience, but who are no longer at their peak physical strength. And these form the last line of defense. And there's a Roman saying, ad triarii eroded, that is, it has come to the triarii, meaning we're in deep shit. Meaning now we're sort of on our last legs, we're down to our last line of defense, and now we're really in trouble. So most of the time it was actually the velites being first employed, and then you had the hastati fighting, who were then replaced by the principes, and that's usually when the fighting was over and the battle was won. The triarii usually didn't actually have to be brought out. Let's look at the weapons used by the legions. So you have very characteristic Roman weapon, the pilu. This is a heavy throwing spear. You can see a picture here. This is quite a heavy weapon, packs quite a punch. It's able to punch through a lot of armor, and has this sort of rather thin shaft at the end. And the reason it is so thin at the end is so that it will actually bend when it hits something. And this means that the enemy is not able to throw back this weapon because it's bent. And then after the battle, you don't throw this thing away, you just hammer it out and straighten it out. And then you can reuse this weapon. This doesn't have a lot of range, thrown at maybe a range of like 15 or 20 meters, but it does pack quite a punch, quite a devastating weapon. Then we have another very characteristic weapon, the short sword, the gladius hispaniensis, typically just known as gladius in English, and a gladius actually just means sword in Latin, and gladius hispaniensis actually means Spanish sword, because this weapon, even though we think of it as being a quintessential Roman weapon, is actually imported from Spain. And of course the Romans also fought with spears. Latin word for spear is hasta. Of course, this is sort of the most traditional, most widely used weapon of humanity. Spears are very effective weapons, and these were the primary weapons of the Romans in the early periods. Later on in the later Republic, we still have the triarii fighting with spears, but for the other units, they have these throwing spears, which in some rare cases could also be used as melee weapons in a pinch. But most of this fought with a short sword and a shield, heavy shield called scutum. Here's one design of Skutung, slightly different shape. Some of them are a bit more rectangular than this. But in any case, the fighting style would be you protect yourself with your shield and you sort of stab around with your sword, exposing not very much of your body, basically just your hand. And you just make these short stabbing motions. The gladiator is not designed as a slashing weapon, it's designed as a thrusting weapon. This is why it has this very acute point here. It's actually a very short sword, but it's relatively solid and heavy. And if it packs quite a punch, you can really punch through mail with this weapon, which is mail is the predominant form of armor used in this period. And so you can actually pierce through mail if you have a heavy enough thrust, but of course you can't slash through mail, that doesn't work. So very much it's a thrusting weapon, not a slashing weapon. Let's look at Carthage. Let's look at Rome's most ferocious, most implacable enemy. Carthage, or Carthago as the Romans called it, is originally a Phoenician colony. It's located in modern Tunisia, and the Phoenicians are a Semitic people and speak a Semitic language. And Carthage becomes a major mercantile empire. It acquires hegemonic status in the Western Mediterranean. It rules the seas and acquires control of some of these Italian islands, which is how they came into conflict with the Romans. Like Rome, Carthage is a republic with a lot of oligarchic features. Like Rome, you have two annually elected chief magistrates called suffets. Their army, unlike the Roman army, is mostly composed of foreign mercenaries. However, their navy is mostly manned by the native Phoenician population. The Carthaginians practiced a polytheistic religion, which is derived from the Canaanite religion. And they also possibly practiced child sacrifice. There's some scholarly debate over this. Most scholars believe that they did indeed practice child sacrifice because lots and lots of ancient sources, Greek and Roman sources, mention this practice, and there's also some archaeological evidence pointing towards that. But there are also some scholars who point out that these are all hostile sources. Both the Greeks and the Romans fought various wars against the Carthaginians and have every incentive to portray the Carthaginians in a more negative light. But as I said, probably they did indeed practice child sacrifice on a rather large scale. Carthaginians had various treaties with Rome. The first one actually dating to the first year of the Republic, 509 BC. And here they defined spheres of influence. The Romans were not supposed to interfere with the Carthaginians in their territory, whereas the Carthaginians agreed to leave Italy alone. Let's look at this nice little map, which shows us Rome and Carthage on the eve of war. So we see the Carthaginian territory extends here over these islands, which we think of as being Italian islands, and also here all along the coast here in Northern Africa, as well as small part here of Spain. Now this map, as well as all the following maps and all the maps so far, should be taken with a grain of salt. So these borders are not as neatly defined as borders are today, and in a lot of cases we don't actually know the precise extent of these borders. So, as I said, this is just a general map that's supposed to give you a general idea, but take this with a good dose of salt. Here is a more detailed map of Sicily, which is where most of the war is going to take place. So in 288 we have a company of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines, the Sons of Mars, who conquer and occupy Messana, modern day Messina, and they then ravage this countryside here and come into conflict with the Syracusans. Syracusans attack them and defeat them in battle and besiege the city of Messina. The Mamertines call for help. They call for help from both Carthage and Rome, the nearby major powers. Carthage responds first, sends a detachment to them and beats back the Syracusans, forces them to make a peace with the Mamertines, and the Carthaginians then install a garrison in Messana, which the Mamertines apparently don't like. And it's not entirely clear what happens next, but in any event, Rome also dispatches an army, whether this is responding to the original plea for help or whether the Mamertines asked for help again to expel the Carthaginians is not quite clear. But in any case, Romans arrive, and together with the Mamertines, they throw out the Carthaginians from Messina, and as a result Rome and Carthage find themselves at war, and Rome is also simultaneously at war with the Syracusans, who are allied to the Carthaginians. So first of all, the Romans decide to take out Syracuse. They send out an army which in 264 ends up besieging Syracuse, and the Syracusans fairly quickly sue for peace, and because they have to deal with this other enemy, the Romans decide to offer them very generous terms, and Syracuse only has to pay 100 talents of silver as an indemnity, and the Syracusans agreed to supply the armies of Rome in Sicily. Then they take the war to the Carthaginians, as various fighting ensues, and finally in 262, 2 years later, the Romans besiege and then capture the city of Agrigentum. Then of course the war has to be taken to the sea, because well, you're fighting over an island. Controlling the seas is very important. The problem for the Romans here is that they don't really have a navy. A lot of the ancient sources say that they didn't have any sort of navy. That's maybe not very plausible, but in any case they didn't have a very strong navy. They were not accustomed to fighting on sea. Rather, they were just good at fighting on land. And as the story goes, they captured a Carthaginian vessel and then copied their design to build their own fleet. However that may be, by 261 the Romans have a proper fleet, and in 260 they actually win a naval victory at the Battle of Mylae, modern day Milazzo, down here. But the Carthaginians are not so easily beaten. So in 256 the Romans become a bit overconfident after some of the initial successes, and actually send an army to invade Africa and try to defeat the Carthaginians in their backyard. So on the way there, they win a naval victory at the Battle of Ignomos, and they also have some success initially, but one of the leaders of this army, Consul Marcus Atilius Regulus, is captured and his army scattered to the winds. But the Romans managed to actually pick up most of the remaining men and rescue them. However, on the way back, most of this fleet is destroyed by a storm, so the gods apparently are favoring the Carthaginians. And meanwhile, the fighting in Sicily continues. Rome is slowly gaining further territory, but it's all very slow going. And then in 249 we have another major victory for Carthage at the Battle of Drepana. And at this point, Carthage believes that they've pretty much won. They think, Romans are beaten, destroyed their fleet, and they probably don't have any chance of opposing us on the sea. So since fleets are expensive and they're merchant souls, they don't want to spend more money than they have to, they started demobilizing their own fleet. So at this point they think that the victory is basically a foregone conclusion, and just have to wrap up some fighting on land in Sicily, but since they control the seas, it shouldn't be too hard, because it's a lot harder for the Romans to reinforce. But the Romans are stubborn bastards. They don't know when to call it quits. And so even though in 247 you have Hamilcar Barca landing in Sicily, even though the Romans lost at sea, they still continue fighting in Sicily, while Hamilcar Barca manages to fight a successful guerrilla campaign in Sicily. Actually one of the first times in history where guerrilla warfare was successfully implemented. So Barca is able to stop further Roman advances by keeping his army in the field, avoiding major engagements, harrying the supply lines of the Romans and so on. So there's not much happening in Sicily. There's inconclusive fighting. So even though the Carthaginians think that the war is more or less a foregone conclusion, the fighting still continues, and Rome then decides to build another fleet, financed by very generous donations of wealthy citizens who are public-minded and who want to win this war. And indeed, with this newly constructed fleet, they catch the Carthaginians completely off guard, and they win a decisive battle at the Battle of the Igates in 241, and at this point the Carthaginians just call it quits. They're not as stubborn, not as obstinate as the Romans, and so they sue for peace. The Romans impose very harsh terms. So Carthage has to pay 2,200 talents of silver over the next 10 years, an enormous sum. And Rome also gains Sicily, except for Syracuse, which stays independent, a couple of smaller islands, and then they also managed to seize other islands later on. And major problem for Carthage is to actually meet this indemnity, and they also have problems actually paying their mercenaries, or at least the mercenaries claim that they've not been properly paid, and they revolt. This is a very bloody revolt that seriously endangers the Carthaginian state, but it is eventually defeated and suppressed in a very brutal fashion by Hamilcar Barca, who's returned from Sicily. And so the Carthaginians managed to save themselves from complete destruction, and over the coming years they proceed to rebuild their empire and biding their time for revenge. And revenge will come in next video, where we're going to cover, of course, the Second Punic War, as well as the various other wars by which Rome becomes master of the Mediterranean, as well as starting to look at these reformers like the Gracchi and Marius, who make some necessary reforms but also lay the seeds for the destruction of the Roman Republic. If you like this presentation, please give it a thumbs up. Please leave your comments down below. If you have any corrections, any questions, comment down below. And if you want to be notified when the next video in this series comes out, please subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you next time. Valete!